much. And thank you everybody for coming here today to hear my talk about creativity and madness. I figured, what is a creativity conference without talking a little bit about madness, the madness that often accompanies creativity. And so I'm a psychiatrist, and I treat a lot of conditions ranging from anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, sometimes schizophrenia, and the like. And I have a great interest in treating creatives, individuals who are brilliant and able to create great works of art, and oftentimes are plagued by certain things. And so one of my questions, as I was asked by Maxim, who's a friend of mine, to create a talk for this conference, was, is there indeed a link between creativity and madness? And if so, and when I say madness, I mean any sort of mental illness, madness just being a colloquial term. And so if so, what is that link? How can we understand it? And so this is what my talk today is about. I'm going to talk for about 20 or so minutes, after which I'm going to open it up to your questions. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. Aristotle believed that those who become eminent in philosophy, politics, and poetry, and the arts all have tendencies towards melancholia. Seneca stated that no great genius has ever existed without some touch of madness. And Socrates said that the poet has no invention in him until he's been inspired out of his senses. And so this is in the past and present. We know that in ancient Greece, for instance, Plato noted so many eccentricities among the poets and playwrights. Aristotle saw that creative types can get depressed. And then we have Vincent van Gogh cutting off his ear, Sylvia Plath sticking her head in an oven, and Robert Schumann hearing voices to guide his music. As is well established in the public conscience, some of the most brilliant and creative people in their fields have been plagued by mental illness, some even succumbing to suicide. And here is one such person, who is the brilliant comedian and actor, Robin Williams. He had a lifelong struggle with depression and addiction, cocaine and alcohol addictions, and at the age of 63 committed suicide by hanging himself in his California home. On autopsy, they showed that he had a Lewy body disease with some Parkinsonian symptoms. So it might not have been purely mental health issues that contributed to the suicide and what he was experiencing. Mozart was a musical prodigy and one of the most influential composers of our time. He started composing at the age of 4, started touring at the age of 6, wrote the first symphony shortly thereafter, and he could listen to music and then, after hearing it, only once be able to replay it. He likely had depression, possibly bipolar 2, and possibly also Asperger's, which is in the autism spectrum disorders, and Tourette's. So what are some of the things that he exhibited? So Mozart had repeated facial expressions, unintentional constant motion of his hands and feet, and a tendency towards jumping. Furthermore, it was said that Mozart's hearing was so intense and sensitive that loud sounds often affected him physically, making him sick. These behaviors were regarded by some as auditory and motor tics or fits, and their presence is what supports this diagnosis of Tourette's, or the autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's. Beethoven. One of, obviously, who we all know, Beethoven, one of the most admired composers in the world, suffered from various psychiatric symptoms, including persecutory delusions, volatile moods, explosive rages, and suicidal ideation. He had an incredible capacity for resilience and to cope with adversity, because later on in his life, he became deaf, which was a catastrophe for a musician, but he ultimately embraced this and had an opportunity to fulfill his artistic destiny. Locked in the silent world of his imagination, he created a musical language that was different from anything that had previously existed. He ended up writing sonatas, which vastly exceeded the capacity for resonance of the instruments of his era. And he wrote works such as his Fifth Symphony and Ninth Symphonies, which begin with dramatic conflict and end in triumph and transcendence, paralleling the narrative arc of his own story. So Virginia Woolf, one of the most prominent authors of the 20th century, and a pioneer in the use of stream of consciousness writing as a narrative device. She had her first mental breakdown at the age of 13 after her mother died. She suffered from bipolar illness throughout her life, was institutionalized several times, and attempted suicide at least twice. In 1941, at the age of 59, she drowned herself in a river. Ernest Hemingway, brilliant writer, won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. Many of his works are considered classics of American literature. He was married 4 times, which is often indicative of bipolar illness. You can, in the manic phase, fall in love, get married, things of that nature. And this could happen again and again throughout your life. He also had alcoholism and particularly liked to box, which led to traumatic brain injury. He died by shooting himself with a shotgun at the age of 61. And in his family, his sister, father, and brother also died by suicide. Robert Schumann demonstrated both the creative advantages and disadvantages of mental illness. He was a 19th century German composer, had bipolar depression and intermittent bouts of psychosis. He spent the last years of his life in an insane asylum where he eventually died of self-starvation at the age of 46. During his episodic depressive periods, he composed virtually nothing because he had difficulty concentrating and was seized by a delusional conviction that he was absolutely worthless. But when he cycled into his hypomanic states, which is a little bit underneath mania, but close to mania, where you're very productive, you think quickly, you talk quickly, he became very, very prolific. He had increased energy, sharpened imagination, a decreased need for sleep, all of which led to him creating more original musical masterpieces. The arc of his career reveals episodic bouts of staggering creativity, where he composed 3 string quartets in a 2-week period and 140 songs in 1 year. So this is Tchaikovsky, a brilliant 19th century Russian composer of the Romantic period. He was chronically plagued by dysthymia, which is a consistent low-grade form of depression, and he was plagued also by suicidal thoughts. He was told by his doctors to compose less to preserve his energy, to go rest. And he said, you know what, that's not something I can do. Work is the only thing that really gives my life purpose and meaning. I need work like I need air to breathe. And as soon as I'm idle, despondency overcomes me. I'm dissatisfied with myself and even hate myself. Only work saves me. Without music, I would go insane. And so most of us have heard of John Nash, who passed away quite recently, a brilliant Princeton mathematician, and the only person to be awarded both the Nobel Prize in Economics and the prestigious Abel Prize for Mathematics. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in 1959 at the age of 31. And after many years of treatment around 1970, his condition slowly improved and he was able to go back to his academic work by the mid-1980s. He also had a son who developed schizophrenia as an adult. Whoops, sorry. Lombroso, a renowned forensic psychiatrist, argued toward the end of the 19th century that genius and madness were closely connected manifestations of an underlying degenerative neurologic disorder. And this echoes Aristotle that said, no great mind has ever existed without a touch of madness. Now, as we explore the connection between madness and creativity, let's first define what is creativity. And when we think about creativity, there's 4 primary types. There's the deliberate and cognitive, and there's actually 60 definitions, by the way, for what creativity is. And so no single definition has uniform acceptance. But here are 4 ways of, categorizing the different ways in which creativity can come to a person. So the deliberate and cognitive creativity comes from sustained work in a discipline. For example, Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, was a deliberate and cognitive creator. He ran experiment after experiment, and eventually that led to an invention. Then there is deliberate and emotional, and that's when a personal crisis leads to a realization of some sort about, for instance, what bad choices or decisions we've made that contributed to a given problem. For example, a relationship breakup, losing a job, going through bankruptcy, things of that nature, could then help people to realize what was their mistake and to use that mistake in the service of themselves to create a new reality and change their life. Then there is spontaneous and cognitive. And an example of that kind of creativity is a sudden realization based on rational analysis, like when Isaac Newton discovered gravity after an apple fell on his head from a tree. And finally, there's spontaneous and emotional. This is the kind of creativity exhibited by great artists and musicians who produce great music within minutes. They just are overcome by inspiration and are able to channel that into creativity. So what is the connection between creativity and intelligence, or IQ? So it's been a subject of a lot of scientific research. And the most important notion linking the two is this threshold hypothesis, which presumes that above average intelligence is necessary for a high level of creativity. But according to this hypothesis, this correlates with about 120 IQ points. So as you go from a low IQ to a IQ of 120, your creativity gradually increases. But at 120, it kind of peters off. The association fades away. And that's because of the difference between creative potential and creative achievement. Creative potential refers to the individual's ability to generate something novel and useful, whereas creative achievement refers to the actual realization of this potential into a real-world accomplishment, such as having made a scientific discovery or having written a novel. So you can have a ton of potential, but because of other factors, not be able to manifest that as achievement. The neuroscience of creativity is actually also quite interesting. In the past, it was believed that the neuroscience of creativity was predicated on the difference between the right brain and the left brain, or the right and left hemispheres of the brain. The right side of the brain has been thought to be responsible for creativity, passion, sensuality, and being poetic, whereas the left side of the brain is responsible for language, logic, deliberate action, and rationality. Yet recent literature, interestingly, has contradicted these findings. It turns out that creativity actually is a little bit more complex and nuanced, and that there are three primary networks that are involved. Depending on the stage of the creative process and what you're attempting to create, networks from different brain regions are recruited to handle the task. So first, you have the central executive network, which is in this diagram on the right side, and that's otherwise known as the attention network. So this is responsible for targeted attention, concentration, and focus. As we all know, however, the human attention span is incredibly short, so this network often switches rapidly with another network, the imagination network, otherwise known as the default mode network, which for our diagram here is on the left side. The imagination or default mode network is responsible for creative activities involved in imagination, like brainstorming and daydreaming. It's also responsible for social cognition, such as our ability to understand what somebody else may be feeling or how to react in a particular social situation. And finally, in between, here in the middle, there is this saliency network, and that's in charge of monitoring the internal stream of our consciousness, as well as the external stimuli and events. This network makes the decision as to which information, both internal and external, is most salient or most important, and is most adept at solving the problem at hand. And it's this network that's very important in switching between the other networks. So for example, the salience network is in charge of taking the maximum amount of sensory information that you're bombarded with constantly and choosing which sensations you should pay attention to and which ones you should ignore. The salience network also has a really important part of it called latent inhibition. And it's an interesting phenomenon that links creativity to latent inhibition. Latent inhibition is a filtering mechanism to screen irrelevant stimuli that we share with other animals and it's tied to the neurotransmitter dopamine. Research has consistently shown that low latent inhibition is associated with high creativity and originality. So latent inhibition is basically your filter. We have tons of things bombarding us all the time. If our filter is low and we have very low filter capacity, all of that stuff is going to overwhelm us, to the point where, oh my goodness, should we pay attention to, what we're feeling on our skin, or what we're hearing with our ears, or what we're seeing with our eyes, or what we're smelling, or what we're tasting in our mouth, or the thoughts that we're having, or what's going on in our heart? A lot of internal and external stimuli. And then some people have very high latent inhibition. They're very good at focusing on the task at hand, and they don't really focus on all the other things coming in. But it's been shown for creativity that it's good to be able to focus on the task at hand, but also have enough filter capacity so that you're picking up other things as well. When you're focused on the task at hand, but other things can come in, that enhances the creative process.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick warning. We have about 5 minutes left.
So what are the empirical findings here ultimately? So we have that the rate of, and when I say empirical findings, this is, between creativity and mental illness. So first, that highly creative artists are 2 times as likely to experience any kind of psychiatric disorder as non-creative people, depression being the most common, and alcoholism and suicide also correlating. And the more eminent the creator, the higher the intensity of mental illness. And the intensity of the symptoms also vary according to the domain of creativity. So 80% of famous poets can have some sort of mental illness, whereas only 28% of scientists do. And it's genetic, basically. So the family lines, which produce the most prominent creators, also tend to have higher rates and intensities of mental illness. So with bipolar disorder, first-degree relatives of people with bipolar are more creative. And creativity is particularly likely in people who have milder forms, because if you have too severe form of any sort of mental illness, it doesn't add to creativity, but actually just keeps you from being able to function in the world. For substance use disorders, it's actually quite similar. While alcohol could be a mental lubricant and help people a little bit, if they become full-blown alcoholics, it hinders their progress very much so. And alcohol use proved detrimental to productivity in 75% of people, looking at individuals who had New York Times book reviews written about them or biographies published between 1960 and 1990. So they found a general increase in alcohol abuse in artists, especially in writers. So what's the treatment for this? The treatment, there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of resistance, and that's because people don't want to be labeled mentally ill. They don't want it to affect their reputation. They fear that psychiatric medication could hinder their creativity. And they actually think sometimes being a little mad is necessary to be creative, and they don't want to be normal. And sometimes also there could be illusions of invincibility and grandiosity. And finally, in conclusion, mental illness and creativity are closely related, sharing many traits and antecedents. Severe mental illness is negatively associated with creativity. So people with full-blown schizophrenia and alcohol dependence may not be creative, but only milder forms of all illnesses may be conducive to creativity. And IQ determines creative potential, but not creative achievement. And finally, it's very important, yet particularly challenging, to treat mental illness in creatives. And the treatment must focus on ways to enhance and sustain their creative potential over the lifespan. Thank you. So now I'm opening up to any questions that people have. I think we have a few more minutes. I think we have actually 7 minutes of questions.
We have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes of questions. Great. We have time for one question. Neurodiversity versus madness. Okay, thank you. That's a good question. So that question is, maybe it's not really madness, but it's really just genetic variants that create diversity and have many, many positive qualities as well. And that's absolutely right. The very fact that mental illness and creativity correlate in this way means that those things that could make someone mentally ill also do have positive antecedents and also are responsible for some of the most brilliant people in our society and community. So yes, absolutely. Do we have, let's see, any more questions? Define madness. Okay, madness is really just a term that's colloquial, but it's really mental illness. Mental illness, which could be anxiety, depression, bipolar illness, schizophrenia. I use it more kind of artistically, but it's really just any form of mental illness. And yes, neurodiversity is absolutely, just as with mental illness, a synonym for that.